Hey, I'm Serious Mr. McCarty here, and today we're going to continue our conversation about American imperialism, and we're going to focus on the Spanish-American War and its effects. The Spanish-American War started basically because of Cuba. Cuba had been a Spanish colony for hundreds of years, and they were trying to break away from Spain. In 1868, they rose up against Spain but failed, and then another rebellion started in 1895 to break away from Spain. Spain sent over General Weyler the Butcher to basically crush this rebellion. He started killing thousands and thousands of Cubans. He created reconcentrados, concentration camps, and rounded up Cuban people in concentration camps. Cuba is only 90 miles away from America. And so America saw what was going on in Cuba and saw this European power basically killing people in our hemisphere. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine said the Western Hemisphere was our hemisphere. And so America basically decided to do something about it. And we became involved in the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Let's talk about some of the reasons behind that. So there's really three major reasons behind why we joined the Spanish-American War. One of them is going to be economic reasons. Because Cuba was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, we had a strong trade network with Cuba. In fact, America had over $50 million invested in Cuba, and we had a $100 million trade with Cuba every single year. In fact, 90% of all Cuba's exports came to America. And so when Spain came over and started the war with Cuba, for 3 years, from 1895 to 1898, that disrupted American trade. It actually threatened American property because there's American farmers who owned sugar plantations in Cuba. So American trade was threatened and American property was threatened in Cuba. So economics played a major role in this. Another major factor in this was the moral reasons. As I mentioned previously, the Cuban people were suffering in these reconcentrados. And at the time period, we had what's called yellow press. Yellow press is exaggerated journalism. So we had two major newspapers in New York, the New York Journal and the New York World. William Randolph Hearst of the Journal and Joseph Pulitzer of the World. And they were basically competing newspapers to see who could sell the most newspapers. And what sells newspapers better than war? And so they exaggerated some of the atrocities that were happening. Today we would call it fake news. They exaggerated the atrocities that were happening in Cuba, which really tugged at the heartstrings of Americans. And Americans wanted to help Cuba. Cuba is struggling to break away from their European overlord, just like we broke away from England back in the Revolutionary War. And so we really felt empathy for Cuba, and this yellow journalism actually spurred that empathy on. With the yellow journalism, and William Randolph Hearst, it's a famous story of William Randolph Hearst sending a reporter down to Cuba and telling him to cover the war in Cuba. And when his journalists got there, his journalists responded back through a telegram saying, "There is no war. I don't know what you want me to cover." And then William Randolph Hearst replied back, "You supply the photographs, I'll supply the war." And that's exactly what William Randolph Hearst did. And that brings us to our third major reason why America got involved, and that's military reasons. In 1898, because American property in Cuba was under threat, America sent the USS Maine, a battleship, down to Havana Harbor to kind of threaten Spain to back away from American property and also evacuate any American citizens. And then on February 15th, 1898, the US Maine mysteriously exploded and killed 266 US sailors. At the time, we did not know what caused that explosion, but William Randolph Hearst, wanting to sell newspapers, immediately blamed it on the Spanish, and an uproar of anti-Spanish sentiment began in America, and we got the phrase, "To hell with Spain, remember the Maine." There was anti-Spanish newspapers and magazines and even songs that people were singing. People wanted revenge on the Spanish for blowing up the Maine and killing American sailors, but it turns out there was no evidence for that, and once we investigated, we actually found out that it probably wasn't the Spanish. And today we believe it was actually an accident that happened in the coal room that started a fire and blew up because the ammunition room was there as well. And so it's probably an internal explosion, not an external explosion. So we went to war based on a lie. Now, compared to other American wars, this is a very short war. In fact, Secretary of State Hay called it a splendid little war. At first, McKinley didn't want to go to war. McKinley was a Civil War veteran, in fact, the last Civil War veteran to be president, and he understood the effects of war and did not want to take America into another war. But this public push against Spain because of the yellow journalism and also because of big business basically pushed McKinley into war. So Congress declares war for the third time in American history on Spain, and we have the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War only lasted 4 months, and there's not a whole lot of huge battles. In battle, Americans only lost 400 soldiers compared to maybe 5,000 Spanish soldiers. But disease was still a big killer due to things like malaria, and we lost thousands of Americans due to disease. But it was a 4-month war, 400 Americans killed due to combat, and we beat the Spanish. Now, the first battle of the war actually didn't happen in Cuba, and it might give you a little bit of insight into our real intentions in Cuba. When we first joined the war, the spending bill to pay for the war, we added an amendment called the Teller Amendment, which basically said we are not going to war in Cuba to annex Cuba. We are just going there to help the Cuban people, which makes it sound like we're doing it for benevolent reasons. And so we have no intentions of annexing Cuba. But the very first battle of the war wasn't in Cuba. It wasn't even in the Atlantic. It was in the Pacific. On May 1st, Admiral Dewey took his fleet from China, ordered by Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, to go to Manila Bay in the Philippines and attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines. It was a huge success. We destroyed the entire Spanish fleet. But why was our first battle to help the Cubans in the Philippines? And it gives you some insight into what our true intentions might have been. Like I said, there's not a whole lot of battles. We have the Battle of San Juan Hill, which is where Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders are his voluntary army that he basically got from all of his friends. There was like Ivy League polo players, there was criminals, there was Western ranchers and cowboys that joined it. They paid for their own weapons, they paid for their own horses. It was a volunteer army. Theodore Roosevelt quit his job as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and basically they went down to Cuba to fight in this war because they loved war. His famous event was Battle of San Juan Hill, where him and the Rough Riders charged up the hill and took the hill. However, history often forgets that when he got to the top of the hill, there was actually an African-American unit who had already taken the hill, but we left that out of the history books. And so Theodore Roosevelt gets famous, which sends him on the path to governorship of New York and eventually the path to the White House. And we have that major battle. And then the last major battle was the Naval Battle of Santiago. We beat the Spanish Navy in the Atlantic at the Battle of Santiago, and the Spanish were pretty much done for. Later that year, we signed the Treaty of Paris, and this is where America becomes a world power. Now, we said we weren't going to annex Cuba in the Teller Amendment, and we didn't. We did, however, take Guantanamo Bay, which we still control today. But when Cuba was making their constitution, we added in another amendment to their constitution called the Platt Amendment. We aren't going to annex you, but basically we said we get to intervene in Cuban affairs militarily anytime we desire. And so for the next 30 years, American troops basically occupy Cuba. So we don't annex it technically, but we do have an American military base there, and American soldiers were remaining there for the next 30 years. But we did annex other territories that belonged to Spain. We took over Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines as well. And this is what sets America on the stage for being a world power. We now have colonies in the Atlantic and the Pacific, which leads us to build the Panama Canal to quickly move our navy back and forth between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And it sets the stage for a much larger war, the Filipino insurrection. So now that we took the Philippines from the Spanish, America had to decide what to do with it. McKinley wasn't sure. McKinley was up at night losing sleep. What should we do with the Philippines? The Filipinos rose up under Emilio Aguinaldo to fight the Spanish and wanted their freedom, and America helped them with that. And the Filipinos thought they were going to be free and independent. McKinley had other intentions. McKinley was struggling what to do. He prayed one night to God, and God came down and told him that we need to uplift, civilize, and Christianize those heathen people. And so McKinley decided to take over the Philippines rather than letting them be free and independent. And so this began what we call the Filipino insurrection, the American-Filipino War, one of the blackest moments in American history that we don't really talk about. And so in 1899, American troops went to the Philippines to basically suppress the Filipinos. The Filipinos want to be independent. Emilio Aguinaldo, who fought the Spanish, is now going to turn and fight the Americans. And we have a war that's going to lead to 4,000 American deaths and maybe as many as 250,000 Filipinos dead. The war officially lasted from 1899 to 1903, which is much longer than the Spanish-American War and killed a lot more people. However, the war unofficially went on for another decade until 1913. But the Philippines were eventually brought into American control. And it wasn't until after World War II where the Filipinos became independent. And when it comes to imperialism, we had two sides of the argument, the imperialist and the anti-imperialist. The imperialists argued that it was our duty to go conquer these other nations, that the white Anglo-Saxon race was meant to dominate them. They also had economic argument. It was going to benefit America economically, but it was also going to benefit those countries because we brought them our Western ways, our Western culture, our freedom, and our democracy. The anti-imperialists, which many of them joined the Anti-Imperialist League, people like Mark Twain, argue that this is un-American for us to go conquer the people. We believe in self-governance, self-determination, the consent of the governed, and we were taking that away from these people and forcing them to be our colony against their will. So it was un-American. There was also a racist argument that many people didn't want to be an imperialist power because once we took over the Philippines, does that mean those Filipinos are now American citizens and now we're going to have this wave of Filipino immigration into America? So there was also a racist argument against imperialism as well. And there was court cases to do with this, the Foraker Act, and then eventually several court cases called the Insular cases. Does the flag follow the Constitution? When we take over these other territories, does that mean those territories, they're now American citizens and they're protected by the American Constitution? Well, according to the courts, no. And so these people became American territories, but they did not get the same rights as Americans living on the mainland. So that's it for imperialism, and it sets the stage for America becoming a world power, which is eventually going to drag us into World War I. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks. Bye.